droid. The corridor is a detail people stop noticing after their second week living beside one, and that is precisely the point. Droid. In cities built upward instead of outward, where floor plates are drawn by engineers who never intend to walk through them at night, droid, there exists a specific category of hallway that receives no daylight, no cross-ventilation, and often no explanation. Building codes permit it, droid. Fire regulations tolerate it. Marketing brochures simply omit it. This is the story of one such corridor, droid, on the 14th floor of a residential tower in a district where property listings still use the phrase, well ventilated, as a selling point precisely because so few units actually are. Droid. Wing Ye-chan was 34 when she signed the lease for a one-bedroom unit at the far end of that corridor. Droid. She worked as a claims processor for an insurance firm, a job that paid enough to survive, but not enough to choose where she lived. Droid. The unit she rented was priced roughly 18% below comparable units on the same floor. Droid. A difference her agent attributed to the layout, a word he used with a specific flatness that she noted only in retrospect. At the time, droid, she was simply relieved. 18% meant she could stop borrowing from her sister, droid. 18% meant the deposit didn't require selling anything. She did not ask why the corridor leading to her door had no windows, droid, because in a city where a third of the housing stock was built under maximum plot ratio incentives, internal corridors were not unusual, droid. Developers had long ago discovered that a windowless corridor allowed for more saleable floor area, droid, since no space needed to be sacrificed for light wells or open air walkways. It was an economic decision before it was ever an architectural one, droid. And Wing Yi understood economics. She had built a career on understanding what people were willing to accept in exchange for a lower number, droid. The building itself was unremarkable, 31 stories of beige tile completed in the late 1990s, home to families, retirees, droid, and a rotating population of tenants who treated it as a waypoint rather than a home. The management office operated out of a small room near the lobby, staffed by a caretaker named Mr. Ho, droid, a man in his 60s who had worked in the building since its opening and who greeted every resident by the number of their floor rather than their name, droid. 14, he would say to Wing Ye, not unkindly, simply as identification. She didn't mind. It was efficient, and efficiency was something she respected, droid. The first weeks were unremarkable in the way that early tenancy always is, droid, filled with furniture assembly and the recalibration of a smaller life into a smaller space. The corridor itself she crossed twice a day, droid. Morning and evening, lit by a strip of fluorescent tube lighting that hummed at a frequency she stopped hearing after the first few days. It was long, droid, perhaps 40 meters, servicing 8 units, with a slight bend near the middle that blocked sightline from one end to the other. She noticed, droid, without particular concern, that the air in the corridor was consistently cooler than the air in her flat, droid. Even in months when the building shared air conditioning should have evened out such differences, droid. She noticed that the fluorescent tube nearest her door required replacement more frequently than seemed statistically normal, droid, cycling through 3 replacements in as many months, according to the maintenance log Mr. Ho kept taped inside the utility closet, droid. She noticed these things the way one notices a slightly uneven floor tile, droid, filing them under the category of old building quirks rather than anything requiring further thought, droid. What changed her attention was smaller than an event. It was an absence. Returning home one evening in October, droid, she realized she could not recall the last time she had encountered another resident in the corridor. Not passed, not greeted, droid, not overheard through a door. 8 units serviced that hallway, and in nearly 2 months of residence, she had not once seen a neighbor enter or exit, droid. She mentioned this lightly to a colleague over lunch, expecting the kind of shrug such small talk usually received. Instead, her colleague droid, a woman named Suet Ling, who had grown up in a similar building 3 districts over, asked a question that Wing Ye found oddly specific. Droid. She asked which side of the building the corridor faced, and whether the units along it were priced lower than others on the same floor. Droid. When Wing Ye confirmed both, Suet Ling did not explain further. Droid. Only said that her grandmother used to call such corridors by a term that did not translate cleanly. Droid. Something closer to the space that holds what the flats release, and advised her, without elaboration, to keep her door threshold salted. Droid. A suggestion Wing Ye dismissed as the kind of inherited superstition that surfaces in every family without evidence to support it. Droid. The dismissal held for approximately 3 weeks. During that time, 3 small things accumulated, none of them dramatic enough to report to anyone. Droid. Each of them explainable individually. The first was a change in how her front door closed. It had always required a firm push to seat the latch. Droid. Now it clicked shut on the lightest contact, as though the frame had shifted, though the building's structure was concrete and steel, and did not shift. Droid. The second was a sound she began to associate specifically with the bend in the corridor, a soft settling noise, like fabric adjusting against a wall. Droid. Audible only when she passed that exact point, never elsewhere. The third, and the one she found hardest to rationalize, droid, was a temperature drop localized to a stretch of perhaps 3 meters near her door. Droid. A drop she confirmed was real by holding her phone's weather app beside a borrowed thermometer. Droid. Noting a consistent 2-degree difference between that stretch and the rest of the hallway. Droid. A difference that held across multiple times of day and multiple weeks, ruling out simple draft or appliance heat. Droid. She raised this with Mr. Ho on a Tuesday afternoon, framing it as a maintenance concern rather than anything stranger. Droid. He listened with the particular stillness of a man who had heard the question before and had a prepared, insufficient answer ready. Droid. The corridor's ventilation duct, he explained, ran differently than the rest of the floor. Droid. A legacy of a modification made sometime in the building's 2nd decade, though he could not specify what the modification had addressed. Droid. When she pressed gently on why only her section of the corridor showed the temperature difference. Droid. He offered that older ductwork sometimes cooled unevenly, an answer technically possible and clearly incomplete. What she noticed, droid, more than the answer itself, was that he did not meet her eyes while giving it, and that he mentioned, almost as an aside while turning back to his desk, droid, that units along that corridor turned over tenants more frequently than the rest of the building, droid, a fact he presented as simple record, keeping rather than warning, droid. That evening, rather than let the conversation dissolve into background noise, droid, Wing Ye did what her job had trained her to do. With any claim that didn't sit righty, she looked for the paper trail, droid. The building's management office maintained a public registry of unit ownership transfers required under local disclosure law, droid, technically accessible to any resident who asked. She requested the transfer history for the 8 units along her corridor, a request Mr. Droid Ho fulfilled with visible reluctance, but no legal grounds to refuse. The pattern in the records was not subtle once she laid it out chronologically. Droid. Every unit on that corridor had changed hands or changed tenants at a rate roughly 3 times higher than comparable units elsewhere in the building. Droid. Several showed ownership transfers rather than simple tenancy changes, meaning the prior occupants had not merely moved but sold. Droid. Often at a loss relative to market comparables. Droid. A detail she could confirm because her firm processed property insurance claims and she had professional access to valuation databases. Most residents did not. Droid. She might have stopped there, filed it as an unfortunate, but explicable statistical anomaly, droid. If not for a conversation with the previous tenant of her own unit, a woman she tracked down through a forwarding address left with the post office, droid. A small act of persistence that her sister later called excessive, and that Wing Ye afterward called necessary. The former tenant, a nurse named Mrs. Droid. Feng, who had relocated to a different district, was hesitant on the phone at first, then Droid. Once she understood Wing Ye wasn't calling to complain about a deposit dispute, became almost relieved to talk, Droid. She had lived in the unit for 14 months. She described the same temperature drop, the same soft settling sound at the corridor's bend, Droid, and something Wing Ye had not yet experienced, a period toward the end of her tenancy, Droid, during which she woke consistently between 3 and 4 in the morning with the specific, Droid, wordless certainty that someone was standing just outside her door, a certainty she could never verify because opening the door revealed nothing, Droid. And yet the certainty itself did not diminish with repetition, only deepened, Droid. She had moved out not because of any single incident, but because of an accumulation she described with a nurse's clinical precision, Droid, as kind of pressure that doesn't resolve, and she had taken a loss on her lease, break penalty simply to be rid of it, Droid. It was Mrs. Feng, not any supernatural encounter, who gave Wing Ye the term that reframed everything hung jack, Droid, a phrase her own grandmother had used for spaces where death had occurred and where insufficient ritual attention had been paid afterward, Droid. Spaces considered to retain a kind of residual charge, not malevolent by design but heavy, accumulating further heaviness the longer it went unaddressed, Droid. Mrs. Feng did not know of any specific death associated with the corridor, only that in older buildings, Droid, particularly ones constructed during the city's most compressed development period, Droid. Certain layouts had been quietly understood among Feng Shui practitioners as functioning like drainage channels, Droid. Corridors positioned specifically without windows so that they would not circulate air, would not circulate Ki, Droid, and would instead hold whatever accumulated within a floor's living spaces the way a low point in a landscape holds water after rain. Developers in Mrs. Droid. Feng's account passed down from an uncle who had worked in construction, Droid. Sometimes consulted geomancers during design not to avoid such configurations, but to use them deliberately, treating an internal, Droid, windowless corridor as an acceptable sacrifice, Droid. A contained pocket where negative accumulation could be directed away from the units that needed to remain saleable at full price. Destroyed. The units directly adjacent to the corridor's coldest stretch, she said, were simply the units that absorbed what the corridor could not fully contain. Droid. Wing Ye did not believe this in the way she believed the insurance actuarial tables at her firm, evidence-based and reproducible. Droid. But she believed it in the way a claims processor believes a pattern, not because any single data point proves causation, Droid, but because the accumulation of unexplained, cross-referenced observations exceeds what coincidence comfortably explains. The transfer records, Droid. The temperature anomaly confirmed by instrument, not imagination. The consistency of Mrs. Droid. Feng's account with her own experience despite the two women never having spoken before. The way Mr. Ho's eyes had moved when discussing the ductwork, Droid. None of it was proof. All of it together was a pattern she was no longer willing to dismiss. Droid. She sought out through Suetling's grandmother's old contacts, Droid, a Feng Shui consultant who worked primarily with residential buildings rather than commercial developments, Droid. A semi-retired practitioner named Master Yao, who agreed to walk the corridor with her on a weekday afternoon, Droid, charging a modest fee that felt almost insultingly small, given what she was hoping he might resolve. He did not perform any dramatic ritual, Droid. He walked the length of the corridor slowly, pausing at the bend, running a hand along the wall without ceremony, Droid, checking the corridor's orientation against a small compass he carried in his jacket pocket. His conclusion, delivered without theatrics, droid, was that the corridor's specific alignment channeled what he called descending yin from the floors above, droid, a natural consequence of the stairwell's position relative to the corridor's axis, droid, worsened considerably by the complete absence of any window or opening that might allow the channel to vent rather than pool. He confirmed, droid, in professional but unembellished language, that this was not a rare configuration in buildings of this era and construction type, droid, that he had assessed perhaps a dozen similar corridors across the district, and that in every case remediation was partial at best. Ritual cleansing, droid, incense burning, the placement of mirrors or salt, could reduce accumulation temporarily, droid, particularly effective if performed during the 7th lunar month when, by tradition, droid, wandering spirits were already abroad and more responsive to being redirected, but none of these measures addressed the underlying architectural cause, droid. The corridor would always refill, he said, the way a basin refills after being emptied, because the structure itself, not any single event or death, was the mechanism, droid. Whatever had accumulated there over nearly 3 decades of unaddressed drainage was not the residue of one tragedy, but the compounded residue of ordinary attrition, droid. Illnesses, disputes, small despairs, the unremarkable unhappiness of dozens of tenants across dozens of years, droid. Known dramatic enough individually to warrant investigation, all of it settling into the one part of the floor plan built without any means of release, droid. This was in its way more unsettling than a single ghost story would have been. A haunting with one clear origin can be resolved, appeased, exorcised, droid. A structural accumulation with no single origin, sustained by ordinary human unhappiness passing through an architecturally sealed space over 30 years, droid, had no equivalent resolution. Master Yaw was honest about this. He offered to perform a cleansing, explained its likely temporary benefit, droid, and was equally honest that the only durable solution he had ever seen work was relocation, droid, a fact he delivered with the resigned professionalism of someone who had given this same assessment many times before to many tenants who, like Wing Yi, droid, had chosen the unit for its price and were now calculating whether the discount had been worth it, droid. The financial arithmetic was not simple, droid. Breaking her lease before the 12-month mark meant forfeiting her deposit and paying a penalty equivalent to 2 months' rent, droid, a sum that would erase most of what she had saved by choosing the discounted unit in the first place, droid. She spent several evenings running these numbers with the same detachment she brought to her work, calculating cost against cost, droid, discomfort against solvency, the intangible weight of 3 a.m. wakefulness against the tangible weight of an emptied savings account. She considered, droid, briefly and seriously, simply staying, droid, treating the corridor's cold stretch and the settling sound at the bend the way she treated every other unpleasant condition of urban rental life, droid, as a cost of affordability to be endured rather than escaped, droid. What changed her calculation was not any single frightening night, but a gradual erosion in her own baseline, a growing difficulty concentrating at work, droid, an irritability she did not recognize as her own, a sense increasingly persistent, droid, of being observed at the exact threshold of her apartment door that no longer dissipated once inside. She recognized, droid, with the same analytical distance she applied to fraudulent claims, that whatever the mechanism, the effect on her was measurable, cumulative, droid, and worsening, and that this alone, independent of any belief in its ultimate cause, was sufficient reason to leave, droid. She gave notice at the end of the month, absorbed the financial penalty, and moved into a smaller, droid, more expensive unit on the opposite side of the district, one with a window in every room, including the corridor outside her door, droid. a feature she now specifically searched for in every listing she considered afterward. Droid, treating natural light not as an aesthetic preference, but as a structural safeguard. Mr. Droid. Hull processed her move out paperwork with the same flat efficiency he brought to everything, noting her unit number rather than her name one final time. Droid. And when she asked him directly whether he intended to disclose the corridor's history to the next tenant, Droid, he said only that the listing would describe the unit accurately according to legal requirements, which did not and had never, Droid, included ventilation history or feng shui assessment. The unit was listed within 11 days at the same 18% discount, Droid, described in the agent's copy as offering a cozy, efficient layout ideal for single professionals. Droid. Wing-Ye thought about this often in the months that followed, not with anger exactly, Droid, but with the particular clarity that comes from having priced a risk correctly only after having already absorbed its cost. Droid. The corridor was not unique to her building. Master Yall had assessed a dozen like it. Mrs. Feng had lived through one before her. Droid. Some unknown number of other tenants across other towers built during the same compressed decades of the city's growth, Droid, were at that moment crossing similarly windowless stretches of hallway twice a day, Droid, filing the cold spots and settling sounds under the same category of old building quirk that she once had, Droid. The system that produced these corridors was not a conspiracy in any organized sense, Droid. No committee had convened to decide that certain hallways should absorb what certain flats released, Droid. It was simply the compounded outcome of maximizing saleable area, of geomancers consulted for auspicious placement rather than genuine remediation, Droid, of disclosure laws that had never been written broadly enough to cover what could not be measured on a building inspector's checklist, Droid. The corridor did its work quietly, discount by discount, tenancy by tenancy, Droid, and would go on doing it long after Wing-Ye's name was removed from the registry and replaced by the next name, and the one after that, Droid, each of them arriving for their own version of the same 18%, each of them noticing, if they noticed at all, Droid, only after they had already signed.